By December 1944, the world believed the Third Reich was a beast in its final ragged gasps. To the east, the Soviet steamroller had reached the Vistula, and to the west, the Allied armies had liberated Paris and stood poised at the threshold of the German heartland. The war, for many in the high command of the West, was functionally over, a matter of logistics and clean-up before the spring thaws. However, the forest of the Ardennes held a different perspective. This was a landscape of deep ravines, winding rivers, and ancient skeletal trees that seemed to lean in, whispering of older, more primal conflicts. It was a place where the sun rarely penetrated the canopy of grey fog, creating a perpetual twilight that masked the movements of a dying empire. The air was a thick, damp cocktail of pine needles and stagnant frost, a cold that did not just bite the skin, but settled into the marrow of the bone. In the small villages of the Belgian frontier, places like Bastogne, Houffalize, and Malmedy, the civilian population lived in a state of suspended animation. They had seen the Germans retreat in the summer, fleeing in horse-drawn carts and stolen trucks, a defeated rabble. Now they welcomed the Americans with a mixture of relief and weary caution. The American GI soldiers they encountered were either green recruits from the 106th Infantry Division, sent to this quiet sector to get their feet wet, or the exhausted veterans of the 28th Infantry, the Bloody Bucket, sent here to heal after the meat grinder of the Hurtgen forest. For these men, the Ardennes was a vacation spot. They played cards in drafty lofts, complained about the lukewarm coffee, and stared out at the wall of trees that stood as an impenetrable, silent green barrier. They did not hear the grinding of gears deep in the Eifel Mountains. They did not see the black uniformed men of the 1st SS Panzer Division checking the oil in their King Tigers. The silence of the Ardennes was louder than any shelling they had yet experienced, but it was a silence they mistook for peace. Across the border, the atmosphere was one of frantic, hushed desperation. Under the cover of radio silence and the thickest fog the region had seen in years, the German military was performing a feat of logistical magic. Thousands of tanks, tens of thousands of horses, and hundreds of thousands of men were being funneled into the assembly areas. The 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, sat at the tip of this spear. These were not the conscripted boys or the elderly stomach battalions the Americans had been capturing in recent weeks. These were the elite, the Praetorians of the Nazi regime, men who had survived the horrors of the Eastern Front and whose hearts had been hardened into something cold and unrecognizable. They moved in total darkness, the tank treads muffled by layers of straw laid across the roads, their officers speaking in whispers. They were the ghosts of a crusade that refused to die, fueled by a mixture of fanatical devotion and the grim knowledge that for them there would be no mercy in defeat. As the night of December 15th descended, the temperature plummeted, turning the damp mud into jagged frozen ruts. In the American foxholes, the soldiers wrapped themselves in damp wool blankets, their breath blooming in the dark like tiny, ghost-like clouds. They looked toward the east, toward the dark silhouette of the forest, seeing nothing but the void. They believed the war was a story written by the generals in comfortable chateaus in the rear. They did not realize that the macro map of the Ardennes was about to be rewritten in blood. The micro-reality for the individual soldier was about to shrink to the size of a slit trench, the view through a rifle sight, and the smell of cordite mixing with the metallic tang of blood in the snow. A generation was about to be buried in these woods, not by choice, but by the iron whim of a dictator who believed that one final roll of the dice could hold back the sunset. The iron twilight was fading. The storm was minutes away. The plan was born not in the minds of the Prussian military elite, but in the fevered imagination of a man sequestered in the Wolf's Lair deep in the East Prussian forest. Adolf Hitler, surrounded by flickering maps and the stale air of an underground bunker, envisioned a blow so decisive it would shatter the Anglo-American alliance. He called it Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. On paper, the strategy was a masterpiece of classic German Bewegungskrieg, or maneuver warfare. 3 armies would pierce the thinly held Ardennes line, cross the Meuse River, and capture the port of Antwerp. By seizing the Allies' primary supply hub, Hitler believed he could trap 4 armies in a massive pocket, force a second Dunkirk, and compel the Western powers to sign a separate peace. It was a macro-level gamble of tectonic proportions. However, the generals who looked at the maps saw the cracks in the dream. The logistics were not merely difficult, they were nearly impossible. The spearhead of this desperate gamble was the 6th Panzer Army, and at its heart was the 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. This was the architect's personal guard, a unit that carried the weight of the Nazi Party's darkest ideology and its greatest tactical expectations. To be a member of the LSSSAH was to be part of a dark aristocracy. Their uniforms were black, their cuff titles bore the name of the Führer, and their history was written in the blood of both soldiers and civilians across 2 continents. Under the command of the brutal and charismatic Joachim Peiper, the division's premier Kampfgruppe, the battle group, was tasked with the most critical role. They were the lightning that was supposed to strike the Meuse within 48 hours. The logistics of the Leibstandarte were a study in heavy metal excess and crippling scarcity. At the head of Peiper's column sat the Tiger II, the King Tiger. These 70-ton monsters were armed with the deadly 88mm KWK-43 L-71 gun, and they were nearly invulnerable to any American tank of the era. To the men inside, the tank felt like a mobile fortress, smelling of hot oil, electrical ozone, and the sweat of 5 men cramped into a steel shell. But these beasts were gluttons for fuel, consuming a gallon of petrol for every few hundred yards of muddy ground. The German High Command had calculated the fuel requirements down to the last litre, yet the supplies were not there. The plan relied on a micro-logistics miracle. The SS would have to capture American fuel dumps along the way to keep their engines turning. They were an elite force fueled by the gasoline of their enemies, a parasitic strategy that left no room for error. The geography of the Ardennes, however, was the greatest enemy of the German architect. The roads were not the wide autobahns of the Reich, they were narrow, winding tracks carved into the sides of steep ravines and choked by dense forests. For a King Tiger, these roads were a nightmare. A single mechanical breakdown or a well-placed American anti-tank gun could turn a narrow pass into a bottleneck, stalling a column miles long. SS officers like Peiper knew this. They compensated for the terrain with a doctrine of speed at all costs. There would be no time for prisoners, no time for caution, and no time for the traditional rules of engagement. They were to move like a scythe, ignoring their flanks and trusting in the frightfulness of their reputation to paralyze the American defenders. As the divisions moved into their final jump-off positions, the weather became the ultimate tactical variable. Hitler had prayed for the Hitler weather, a ceiling of thick, low-hanging clouds and dense fog that would ground the Allied air forces. He knew that without the Jabos, Allied fighter bombers screaming down from the sky, his panzers stood a chance. By the evening of December 15th, the fog was so thick it seemed to swallow the very sound of the idling engines. The forest was heavy with moisture. the branches of the pines sagging under the weight of a damp, grey rime. The stage was set for a clash of titans, but the script was written by a man who had forgotten the difference between a map and the mud. The architect had dreamed of a victory that would change history. However, the men of the 1st SS were about to discover that the American amateurs they despised were far more resilient than the paper divisions on Hitler's table. As the dawn of December 16, 1944 broke, the silence of the Ardennes was not merely broken, it was obliterated. More than 1,500 German artillery pieces unleashed a firestorm along a 140-kilometer front, their muzzles flashing in the pre-dawn gloom like a rhythmic, hellish heartbeat. In the American foxholes, men who had been dreaming of Christmas dinners were buried alive as the very trees above them splintered, raining lethal wooden shards into their slit trenches. For the men of the 1st SS Panzer Division, this was the signal for which they had been waiting in the frozen dark. At the tip of the 6th Panzer Army's drive sat Kampfgruppe Piper, a massive column of 124 armoured vehicles and 2,000 fanatical soldiers. Their mission was speed, and their shadow was about to fall across the Belgian landscape like a shroud. The sensory reality of the SS advance was a symphony of industrial violence. Inside the Panther and King Tiger tanks, the air was a thick, choking fog of exhaust fumes and the sharp, metallic tang of cordite. Outside, the world was a blur of white and grey, the heavy tanks churning the frozen earth into a black, viscous slurry. Joachim Peiper, the commander of this iron fist, was a man who viewed time as his greatest enemy. When his column was delayed by a massive traffic jam caused by the overlapping movements of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, Peiper did not wait for the military police. In a display of the ruthless speed at all costs doctrine, he ordered his Panther tanks to simply ram their way through the horse-drawn wagons and trucks of his own infantry, crushing German equipment into the roadside ditches to clear a path. For the SS, even their own comrades were merely obstacles in the path of the Führer's dream. By midday, the spearhead reached the town of Buchholz, where the American defenders, shocked by the sudden appearance of heavy armor in a quiet sector, surrendered without a shot. Peiper's momentum seemed unstoppable. He bypassed mines by driving his own vehicles through them and seized a vital American fuel depot at Bullingen, capturing 50 prisoners and enough gasoline to keep his thirsty engines turning. The macro map showed a deep, jagged wound in the American line, with the 99th Infantry Division being split in two. To the German High Command, it looked like the breakthrough Hitler had promised. However, the micro-reality on the ground was beginning to take a darker turn. As the SS pushed deeper into the Belgian interior, the thin veneer of conventional warfare began to peel away, revealing the primal brutality beneath. The name Malmedy would soon become a word that steeled the resolve of every American soldier in the Ardennes. On December the 17th, at the Beaunez crossroads, elements of Peiper's column encountered an American truck convoy from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. After a brief skirmish, the Americans surrendered. Roughly 113 unarmed men were gathered in a snow-covered field, their hands raised in the universal gesture of submission. In the biting cold, they waited for the SS to process them. Instead, without warning, the German machine guns opened fire. The sound was a rhythmic, mechanical tearing that echoed through the skeletal trees. Those who survived the initial hail of lead tried to play dead in the reddening snow, but the SS troopers walked among the bodies, delivering mercy shots to the wounded. The silence that followed the massacre was heavier than the winter fog. 84 American bodies were left to freeze in that field, a grim testament to the fact that the Leibstandarte was no longer fighting a traditional war. news of the atrocity spread like wildfire across the front, turning the green American recruits into vengeful veterans overnight. The SS believed they were instilling terror that would paralyze their enemies. However, they had instead ignited a cold, hard fury that would make the coming collision with Patton's elite all the more savage. The spearhead shadow had grown long, but it was a shadow built on blood, and the earth of the Ardennes was preparing to take its payment in kind. In the cold, clinical logic of a military map, the town of Bastogne was nothing more than a cluster of grey stone buildings and a few thousand Belgian souls. However, geography is often the final arbiter of history. Bastogne sat at the centre of a spiderweb, with 7 major roads converging here, cutting through the dense, impassable forests and steep ravines of the Ardennes. For the German High Command, these roads were the carotid arteries of the offensive. Without them, the heavy panzers were confined to narrow, muddy tracks, where they were vulnerable to even the smallest American ambush. To the Allies, Bastogne was a plug in a leaking dam. If it held, the German momentum would bleed out in the snow. If it fell, the road to the Meuse River and the vital port of Antwerp would be wide open. By December the 20th, the macro map of the Ardennes had transformed into a noose, and the 101st Airborne Division was the head inside it. The arrival of the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, was a study in chaotic desperation. They had been rushed from their rest areas in France in open-backed trucks, many of the men still wearing their summer jumpsuits, carrying little more than a single day's rations and a handful of ammunition. As they rolled into Bastogne, they passed the wreckage of the 9th Armoured Division, which had been pulverized by the 2nd Panzer Division in a series of desperate holding actions that had bought the paratroopers precious hours. The sensory reality for these men was one of disorientation and beating cold. The fog was so thick that the trucks had to move with soldiers walking in front of them to feel for the edge of the road. There was no front line, only a series of islands of resistance in the woods, small groups of men huddled in holes, listening for the distinctive rhythmic clatter of German tank treads echoing through the mist. By December 21st, the encirclement was complete. The 5th Panzer Army had swept around the town, isolating the 101st and elements of the 10th Armoured Division. The micro-reality of the siege was defined by the texture of the frozen earth. The ground was so hard that men broke their shovels trying to dig foxholes, eventually resorting to using C4 explosives to blast craters into the soil. The silence of the woods was deceptive. It was a silence punctuated by the screaming Mimis, the multi-barreled Nebelwerfer rockets that left trailing streaks of smoke in the grey sky and turned the pine forests into a lethal rain of wooden splinters. Supplies were critically low. Medics were forced to use cognac as an anesthetic and strips of bedsheets as bandages. The wounded filled the cold, damp cellars of the town, their breath a white mist in the dark. However, the Germans were discovering that their macro strategy was being derailed by the stubbornness of the individual American soldier. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commander of the 47th Panzer Corps, believed that the paratroopers were a spent force. On December 22nd, he sent a formal demand for surrender, citing the certain annihilation of the Allied troops. The response from General Anthony McAuliffe was a single typed word, nuts. But beneath the bravado was a grim, freezing truth. The paratroopers were out of food, low on ammunition, and their feet were turning black with trench foot. They were holding the crossroads not because of a grand strategic vision, but because they had been told to stay. And for the 101st, there was nowhere else to go. The philosophical weight of Bastogne began to settle over both armies. For the 1st SS, still grinding its way through the northern sector, the delay at Bastogne was a catastrophe. Every hour the 101st held the town was an hour the German logistics train sat idling in the snow, burning through their dwindling fuel reserves. The crossroads of fate was no longer just a tactical objective. It was a psychological furnace. The Germans had to break the town to save the offensive. The Americans had to hold the town to save the war. As Christmas Eve approached, the temperature dropped to record lows, and the men in the foxholes looked up at the leaden sky, praying for a miracle. They did not know that hundreds of miles to the south, a man who believed himself to be the reincarnation of ancient warriors was turning his entire army toward them. The crossroads was about to become the site of a collision that would define the elite of both nations. While the 101st Airborne was being slowly strangled in the white hell of Bastogne, a different kind of storm was brewing to the south. In a drafty headquarters in Verdun, General George S. Patton Jr. sat before a map that would have driven a lesser commander to despair. Patton was a man who lived in the friction between the ancient and the modern. He believed in reincarnation and the warrior soul, yet he was the undisputed master of the most complex machine of the 20th century, the armored division. To Patton, a tank was not just a tool, it was an instrument of will. On December the 19th, when General Eisenhower asked how long it would take him to pivot his Third Army 90 degrees and launch a counterattack into the German flank, Patton's answer was as audacious as it was impossible. 3 days. The macro scale of what followed remains one of the greatest logistical miracles in the history of warfare. In the middle of a record-breaking winter, Patton had to disengage 6 divisions from a fierce offensive in the Saar region, turn them north, and march them over 100 miles through icy, congested roads toward the Ardennes. This meant moving 250,000 men, 133,000 vehicles, and 62,000 tons of supplies in a matter of 72 hours. The map of the Western Front was being physically bent by the sheer force of Patton's personality. However, beneath the grand arrows on the general's map, the micro-reality was a brutal, mechanical grind. The sensory experience of this march was defined by the smell of diesel and the sound of iron on ice. The tanks of the 4th Armoured Division, the spearhead of the relief effort, were not designed for the Belgian winter. The grease in the gearboxes froze into a thick paste, and the rubber-padded tracks of the Shermans offered no grip on the glazed roads. Tankers spent the nights welding grousers, steel cleats, onto their tracks just to keep from sliding into the ravines. The air was a biting, crystalline cold that fogged the goggles of the drivers and turned the heavy wool overcoats of the infantry into stiff, frozen boards. Patton himself was a constant, restless presence along the march routes, his polished helmet and ivory-handled revolvers a sharp, defiant contrast to the mud-splattered, exhausted men he was driving northward. Patton's philosophy was simple: attack, attack, and attack again. He viewed the German offensive not as a crisis, but as an opportunity to catch the elite of the Third Reich in a giant pincer. But he knew that his primary adversary was not just the German soldier, but the Ardennes itself. The geography was a maze of narrow valleys that restricted his armor to column-of-one formations, where a single well-placed 88mm gun could halt an entire regiment. The 4th Armoured, Patton's elite, were the mirror image of the 1st SS they were destined to meet. Where the SS relied on fanatical devotion and heavy, slow-moving steel, Patton's men relied on speed, aggressive scouting, and the terrifying weight of American industrial artillery. Attack. As the Third Army closed the distance to Bastogne, the weather remained the final mocking obstacle. The so-called Hitler weather persisted, a leaden grey ceiling that kept the American planes grounded and left the columns vulnerable to ambush. Patton, in a characteristic display of his unique brand of faith, famously ordered his chaplain to write a prayer for good weather for battle. It was a moment of supreme ego, a demand to the heavens to witness the collision he was about to orchestrate. By the night of December the 22nd, the 4th Armoured was only miles from the southern edge of the Bulge. The prophet of armour had delivered his legions to the gates of the furnace. The 1st SS was still looking west toward the Meuse, unaware that the most aggressive commander in the Allied arsenal was about to hammer them from the side. The stage for the steel-on-steel encounter was set. The march was over, and the killing was about to begin in earnest. On December 26, 1944, the macro map of the Ardennes underwent a violent tectonic shift. For 5 days, the 101st Airborne had been a frozen island in a German sea, but the Iron Ring was about to be punctured. At 4:50 p.m., a small column of 3 Sherman tanks from the 4th Armoured Division, Combat Command R, led by Lieutenant Charles Bulge, crested a ridge near the village of Assenois. Through the smoke of burning half-tracks and the haze of a dying winter sun, they saw the skeletal remains of the woods surrounding Bastogne. As the lead tank, Cobra King, rumbled into the American lines, a lone paratrooper rose from a foxhole, his face blackened by soot and his uniform stiff with frozen mud. The siege was technically lifted, but the micro-reality for the men on the ground was far from a celebration. The relief was not a wide gateway. It was a narrow, precarious umbilical cord, a chasm opened in the German line that the Third Reich was determined to cauterize with fire. The atmosphere of the relief was one of exhaustion rather than triumph. The sensory density of the corridor was defined by the texture of the transition. To the south, the 4th Armoured had left behind a trail of spent shells and burned-out Panthers. To the north, the 101st Airborne was surrounded by the stench of overflowing aid stations and the hollow-eyed stares of men who had lived on frozen K rations for a week. However, the German High Command viewed this breach not as a defeat, but as a fatal overextension of Patton's spearhead. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, realized that the American Bastogne salient now posed a mortal threat to his entire army's flank. If the Americans could widen this corridor, the German offensive would be split in two. To seal this chasm, Hitler turned once more to his personal Praetorians. On December 28th, the 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte, was pulled from its failing efforts in the northern sector and ordered to move south with the 39th Panzer Corps Tito. The division was a shadow of its former self, having been bled white in the early days of the offensive, yet it remained a terrifying collection of heavy steel and fanatical will. The orders were explicit. The 1st SS was to strike the eastern flank of the Arlon-Bastogne road, the primary artery feeding Patton's relief effort, and cut the throat of the American advance. They were moving into the Tachon-Loutrebois region, a nightmare of hilly, thickly forested terrain where the temperature had plummeted so low that tank engines had to be started every hour just to keep the oil from turning to sludge. The Americans believed the hardest part was over. Patton's elite 4th Armoured and the 35th Infantry Division were preparing to push outward to expand the pocket. They did not know that the most veteran killers of the Waffen-SS were at that very moment positioning their Panther and King Tiger tanks in the woods just kilometers away. The relief had created a magnet for violence. Bastogne was no longer a besieged fortress. It was the center stage of the entire war. Between December the 30th and the midpoint of January, the casualties in this sector would soar, becoming 1/3 higher than the first half of the battle. As the night of December 29th fell, the silence of the Loutrebois woods was a heavy, suffocating blanket. In the American lines, the 35th Infantry Division moved into the gaps, unaware that they were standing directly in the path of the eastern prong of a massive German counter-strike. Across the field, the black-clad men of the Leibstandarte checked their sights and prayed for the return of the fog. The chasm had been opened. But as the first Tiger tanks began to clatter forward in the pre-dawn gloom of December the 30th, it became clear that this opening would be filled with the bodies of an entire generation. The relief of Bastogne was not the end of the tragedy. It was the beginning of the most savage collision of the war. By the evening of December the 28th, the German High Command had reached a point of icy clarity. The breakthrough to the Meuse had failed. Kampfgruppe Peiper had been dismantled in the north, and the relief of Bastogne had turned Hitler's Antwerp dream into a defensive nightmare. The American corridor into the town was a jagged thorn in the side of the Reich, and General Hasso von Manteuffel knew that unless the Arlon to Bastogne highway was severed, the 5th Panzer Army would be bled dry by the weight of Patton's arriving Third Army. To cauterize this wound, the 1st SS Panzer Division, the Leibstandarte, was summoned south. They were the fire brigade of the Führer, shifted on the macro map from the failing northern front to the desperate struggle for the crossroads. The logistics of this move were a frantic race against both the enemy and the elements. On the night of December 29th, the division began its descent into the Tachon-Loutreboi region, a landscape defined by steep, ice-slicked hills and forests so thick they seemed to swallow the very moonlight. The sensory reality for the SS tankers was one of mechanical agony. The temperature had plummeted far below freezing, turning the grease in the tank turrets into stone, and the narrow roads into ribbons of lethal glass. Fuel remained the ghost that haunted every maneuver. Some units of LSSAH were forced to sit idling for hours, their engines coughing in the dark, waiting for the precious litres of petrol that would allow them to commence their march. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, tasked with destroying the Bastogne salient, organized the Leibstandarte into 2 iron fists for the coming assault. To the north, Kampfgruppe Poetische gathered every available Panther and Mark IV tank, tasked with seizing the village of Loutreboi and hammering through to the highway at Remois-Fosse. To the south, Kampfgruppe Hansen was to drive through the stone hamlets of Villers-la-Bonne-Eau and Losange. The strategy was simple and brutal. They would strike the eastern flank of Patton's corridor, meet the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division attacking from the west, and snap the American umbilical cord like a dry twig. However, the macro map of the German High Command failed to account for the micro-resilience of the American 35th Infantry Division and the 4th Armored Division, who were already digging into the very woods the SS intended to traverse. As H-hour approached at 6 a.m. on December the 30th, a thick sulphurous fog settled over the valleys, masking the sound of 50 German tanks and Jagdpanzers as they tested their gears. The air was heavy with the smell of wood smoke from the Belgian cottages and the ozone of idling electrical systems. For the men of the 1st SS, this was the final act of a dying crusade. They moved toward the Arlon Road, not with the bravado of the summer, but with the grim, mechanical determination of men who knew that the earth of the Ardennes was preparing to receive them. The stage for the most concentrated armoured clash of the campaign was set. The steel was on the road, and the highway to Bastogne was about to become a corridor of fire. The morning of December the 30th arrived not with a sunrise, but with a thickening of the grey gloom that had choked the Ardennes for weeks. At precisely 6:30 a.m., the woods east of the Arlon to Bastogne highway erupted in a cacophony of mechanical rage. This was the Loutreboi Cauldron, a space no larger than a few square miles, where the 1st SS Panzer Division intended to break the back of Patton's Third Army. On the larger scale, the German plan was a classic pincer. Kampfgruppe Potschke, bristling with Panther tanks, would strike from the east to seize the village of L'Outrebois and then pivot toward the vital highway. However, the American 35th Infantry Division, a unit made up largely of National Guardsmen from the Midwest, had spent the night burrowing into the frozen earth. The elite were about to meet the ordinary, and the result would be a slaughterhouse of iron and bone. The sensory reality of L'Outrebois was a nightmare of obscured vision and sudden, violent death. The fog was so dense that tank commanders could not see more than 20 yards ahead, forcing them to navigate by the sound of snapping pines and the frantic shouts of infantry. Inside a Panther tank of the 1st SS, the crew lived in a world of vibrating steel and the sharp, nauseating smell of hot oil and unwashed bodies. When they finally broke cover near the edge of the woods, they were met not by retreating Americans, but by a wall of fire. The 137th Infantry Regiment had positioned their 57mm anti-tank guns in the tree line. The sound of an 88mm German shell hitting a stone farmhouse in L'Outrebois was a sharp, ear-splitting crack that followed the scream of the projectile, a sound the locals called the death whistle. Within minutes, the village was a churning vortex of smoke, masonry dust, and the orange glow of burning fuel. As the day progressed, the micro-story of L'Outrebois became one of individual tank duels at point-blank range. Lieutenant Müller of the LSSAH wrote in his diary of the indomitable stubbornness of the American infantry, who refused to leave their foxholes even as 7-ton steel tracks ground the earth just inches from their heads. One American Sherman tank, hidden behind a haystack, managed to put 3 rounds into the thin side armor of a Panther, turning the German machine into a towering pyre of black smoke. The crew, some of them teenagers who had only known the fanatical propaganda of the Reich, tumbled out of the hatches, their black uniforms alight, only to be cut down by the freezing wind and small arms fire. The contrast of the battle was stark. The SS had the superior armor, but the Americans had the superior artillery. Every time the German tanks gathered for a push, the sky seemed to rain steel as Patton's 105mm and 155mm batteries, guided by observers in the hills, saturated the woods with proximity-fused shells that exploded in the treetops, showering the Germans with lethal splinters. By nightfall, the village of L'Outrebois was a smoking ruin, its streets choked with the carcasses of 7 Panthers and nearly a dozen American vehicles. The silence that returned to the woods was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating weight. The 1st SS had gained a few hundred yards of blood-soaked ground, but the highway remained tantalizingly out of reach. The cauldron had failed to boil over. The philosophical cost was beginning to mount. The Leibstandarte was losing its veteran non-commissioned officers, the men who had survived the Dnieper and the Seine, and replacing them with nothing but ghosts. Today, the fields around L'Outrebois are peaceful, the undulating hills covered in lush grass, but for those who know the geography of the Bulge, the earth here feels heavier, forever impregnated with the iron and oil of a generation that burned itself out in the fog. While the iron struggle for L'Outrebois raged to the north, a smaller, more intimate horror was unfolding 3 miles to the south at Villers-la-Bonne-Eau. If L'Outrebois was a cauldron of armor, Villers-la-Bonne-Eau was a tomb of stone and ice. The village was little more than a collection of sturdy Belgian farmhouses and a church clustered in a shallow valley. On the macro map, it was merely a waypoint for Kampfgruppe Hansen of the 1st SS as they sought to sever the Arlon Road. However, for the men of the 35th Infantry Division's 137th Regiment, this village became the center of the universe and the site of their possible extinction. By the morning of December the 30th, the temperature had reached a level of cold that felt like a physical assault. The moisture in a man's nostrils would freeze with every breath, and the steel of a rifle was a searing, skin-tearing agony to touch with a bare hand. The micro-story of Villers-la-Bonne-Eau is one of the most harrowing of the entire Ardennes campaign. 2 companies of American infantry, Company K and Company L, found themselves isolated within the thick stone walls of the village houses as the 1st SS closed in. The sensory density of this engagement was defined by the smell of ancient dust shaken from the rafters by tank shells and the copper tang of blood cooling on frozen floorboards. The SS did not simply attack the village, they systematically dismantled it. Using flame-throwing tanks and high-velocity 75mm guns at point-blank range, they turned the farmhouses into ovens. The American GIS moved from cellar to cellar through holes smashed in the walls, their world reduced to the flickering light of burning haylofts and the rhythmic, terrifying clack, clack, clack of German MP-40 submachine guns. The pivot of this chapter lies in the sheer, desperate scale of the American response. Realizing that the village was being used as a staging area for the SANs to launch their final thrust at the highway, the American command made a cold, utilitarian decision. If they could not hold the village, they would erase it. Over the course of the next 48 hours, American artillery batteries, the elite steel of Patton's Third Army, poured 6,000 rounds of high-explosive shells into a space no larger than a few city blocks. The sound was not a series of explosions, but a continuous earth-shaking roar that felt like the world was being ground between 2 giant stones. The stone houses, some of which had stood since the Middle Ages, were reduced to piles of grey rubble, burying both the German attackers and the American defenders in a common grave of masonry and snow. The philosophical echo of Villers-la-Bonne-Eau is found in the silence that eventually followed the barrage. When the 35th Division finally retook the town days later, they found that the geography had been fundamentally altered. The buildings were gone, replaced by a jagged landscape of craters and splintered timber. In the cellars, they found the frozen blood, men who had died of their wounds in the dark, their bodies preserved by the intense cold in the positions they had occupied during their final moments. Out of the 169 men of Company L who had entered the village, only a handful remained. The 1st SS had been stopped, their momentum shattered against the ruins of a town that no longer existed. Today, a small memorial stands in the rebuilt village, but the earth beneath the new pavement still contains the shrapnel and the stories of a generation that held the line at the cost of their very existence. While the generals in their distant chateaus moved wooden blocks across paper maps, the micro-reality of the Ardennes was lived in the dark, damp silence of the Belgian root cellars. The geography of the Bulge was not just a battlefield, it was a home to thousands of farmers, shopkeepers, and children who suddenly found themselves caught in the grinding gears of 2 massive industrial war machines. In villages like L'Outrebois and Villers-la-Bonne-Eau, the transition from peace to purgatory was instantaneous. The air, once filled with the scent of wood smoke and the ringing of church bells, was now a toxic fog of pulverized masonry, sulfur, and the metallic tang of blood. The weather, a relentless freezing damp, became a secondary enemy. For the civilians, the macro strategy of Hitler's gamble meant that their stone cottages were no longer shelters, but tactical obstacles to be demolished by 75mm tank rounds or incinerated by flamethrowers. The sensory density of life in the cellars was a study in sensory deprivation and terror. Families huddled together on dirt floors, the darkness lit only by the occasional flicker of a tallow candle or the orange glow of a house burning above them. They lived by sound. They learned the difference between the low, guttural growl of a German Maybach engine and the higher-pitched whine of an American Sherman. They heard the death whistle of incoming artillery, a sound that signaled the end of a neighbor's barn or the collapse of a centuries-old church. However, the greatest fear was not the steel, but the men in the black uniforms. The reputation of the first SS Leibstandarte preceded them. In nearby Stavelot and Trois Ponts, the SS had already demonstrated their frightfulness, executing over 100 civilians, including women and children, in a paranoid frenzy of counterinsurgency. In the cellars of the Bastogne corridor, the Belgians held their breath every time boots crunched on the frozen snow above, praying that the door would stay closed. The philosophical echo of the civilian experience is found in the irony of liberation. In September, they had cheered the Americans as heroes, and in December, they watched as those same heroes were forced to call down time-on-target artillery barrages that leveled their villages to flush out the SS. A generation of Belgian children grew up in those weeks with the understanding that their lives were the collateral of a greater crusade. Hunger was a constant, gnawing presence. With the livestock slaughtered by shrapnel or confiscated by retreating Germans, and the potato pits frozen solid, many families survived on nothing but melted snow and scraps of K-rations tossed to them by sympathetic GIS. The silence of the Ardennes, once a source of pride for the mountain folk, had become a graveyard quiet. As the first SS began their slow, bloody withdrawal in early January, they left behind a landscape that looked more like the surface of the moon than the Belgian countryside. The screams of the innocent were not just the literal cries of the wounded, but the silent, echoing trauma of a population that had seen their world erased. The scars were not just on the land, but in the memory of every survivor who would forever associate the smell of wood smoke with the approach of a Tiger tank. Today, the rebuilt houses of the Ardennes are beautiful and sturdy, their stone walls concealing the fact that they were once the backdrops for massacres and the tombs of those who had no part in the architect's dream. The earth remembers the blood of the soldier, but it also holds the tears of the civilian, a reminder that in history's greatest tragedy, the smallest voices often carried the heaviest burden. The end did not come with a single dramatic explosion, but with a change in the color of the sky. For weeks, the Hitler weather, that thick protective shroud of grey Atlantic fog, had been the German army's most reliable ally. However, in the first days of January 1945, a high-pressure system moved over the Ardennes, and the ceiling finally lifted. The sun that rose over the snow-covered ridges of the Bastogne corridor was a cold, brilliant white, and for the men of the 1st SS Panzer Division, it was the color of death. From the west, the hum of distant engines grew into a deafening roar as the Allied air forces, the Jabots, descended like a plague of locusts. P-47 Thunderbolts and Typhoons, armed with rockets and napalm, swarmed the narrow Belgian roads. On the macro map, the German supply lines were being severed with surgical precision. For the individual SS tanker, the reality was a frantic scramble to hide a 70-ton King Tiger under a few saplings, knowing that the glint of sun on a lens or the steam from an exhaust pipe would bring a rain of fire from above. The logistics of the Leibstandarte had finally hit the wall of physical reality. The parasitic strategy of capture or die had failed. In the woods around L'Outrebois and Vordines, the elite of the Reich were reduced to a state of primitive desperation. The tanks that had spearheaded the greatest gamble of the war were now nothing more than stationary pillboxes, their fuel tanks bone dry, and their crews forced to siphon petrol from the wreckage of their own transport columns. The sensory density of the collapse was defined by the smell of scorched rubber and the sight of abandoned steel. Roads were choked with the skeletal remains of the first SS Panthers, with their turrets blown off, half-tracks abandoned in the mud with their engines still idling, and the frozen bodies of young men who had been promised a new world only to be left in a Belgian ditch. The however of the offensive was now undeniable. The steel of the Third Army was harder, and the industry behind Patton was inexhaustible. As the order to retreat was finally given, the facade of the invincible guard crumbled. The retreat was not a disciplined withdrawal, but a harrowing gauntlet through a landscape that had become a trap. The 1st SS began to leak away to the east, abandoning heavy equipment and moving in small, haunted groups through the ravines. The philosophical echo of this moment was the realization of the cost. The men who had crossed the border in December with dreams of Antwerp were now fighting simply to reach the safety of the Siegfried Line. The elite status they had cherished was now a burden. They became priority targets for every American battery and for every vengeful paratrooper who remembered the blood in the snow at Malmedy. The quiet that returned to the Ardennes was a vacuum, as the German presence was sucked out of the territory they had briefly and brutally occupied. The final stand of the Liebstandarte in the Ardennes was a series of bitter, small-scale rearguard actions. At places like Houffalize, they turned their remaining guns one last time to buy minutes for their comrades to escape. The air was thick with the black smoke of burning Tiger tanks, deliberately destroyed by their own crews to prevent them from falling into American hands. By mid-January, the Bulge had been flattened. The 1st SS Panzer Division had entered the battle as a hammer. They left it as a handful of splinters. They had met Patton's elite and had been ground into the frozen earth. The collapse was complete. As the survivors crossed back into the Reich, they left behind not just a battlefield, but the graveyard of the Nazi regime's last hope. The profit of armor had won, but the cost was etched into every mile of the road back to the German border. When the final echoes of the 88mm guns faded, and the last King Tiger tank was abandoned in the mud, a heavy, unnatural silence returned to the Ardennes. It was a silence louder than the shelling, a void left behind by the withdrawal of nearly 1 million men and the death of an entire era. The macro map of Europe was now being drawn by diplomats in Yalta, but the micro-reality of the Belgian frontier was a landscape of jagged black stumps where forests once stood, and villages that had been reduced to literal dust. The collision between the 1st SS Liebstandarte and Patton's Third Army was over. For those who survived, the war had merely transitioned from a physical struggle into a psychological haunting. The Ardennes had become a vast, open-air cathedral of trauma. The fate of the elite was settled not on the battlefield, but in the sterile courtrooms of the Dachau trials. Joachim Peiper and Sepp Dietrich, the architects of LSSA's frightfulness, were brought before an American military tribunal in 1946. Peiper's defense reflected the cold ideology that had fueled his division. He argued that in the total war of the Ardennes, there was no room for the luxury of prisoners. He was sentenced to death, though the sentence was later commuted, and he lived to see a world that had moved on from his dark crusade. However, the shadow of Malmedy followed the men of the 1st SS Liebstandarte to their graves. The Liebstandarte cuff title, once a badge of fanatical pride, became a mark of Cain. The division that had begun as a bodyguard for a dictator ended as a footnote in a criminal indictment. Today, the geography of the Bastogne-Arlon corridor is a study in quiet remembrance. At the Baugné crossroads near Malmedy, a black stone wall stands in the very field where 84 Americans were gunned down in the snow. The names are etched into the rock, their letters filled with a haunting silence. In Bastogne, the Mardasson Memorial rises like a massive, five-pointed star above the hills, a stone macro statement of Allied gratitude. But the truest memorials are found in the micro-scars of the earth itself. In the woods around L'Outrebois and Villers-la-Bonne-Eau, you can still find the foxholes, now shallow, moss-covered depressions in the soil, and the jagged, rusted fragments of American shrapnel embedded deep within the trunks of the pines. The trees have grown around the metal, swallowing the evidence of the violence, yet the iron remains. The philosophical cost of the battle is a weight that still throbs beneath the concrete of the rebuilt villages. For the Belgian civilians who huddled in cellars, the Ardennes is not a story of elite Bidin versus elite, but a story of the screams of the innocent. A generation grew up with the knowledge that their homes were merely tactical obstacles. For the American GIS, who held the line, the Bulge was the moment they discovered the depth of their own resilience and the capacity for human cruelty. The victory was total. However, the scars on the collective soul of Europe took decades to even begin to close. The Ardennes became a global symbol, a place where the battle of ideas was fought with steel and blood. As the sun sets over the ridge at Remoifosse today, the fog still rolls in from the east, thick and grey, just as it did in December 1944. The air is damp, smelling of pine and wet earth, hiding the movements of modern tourists where once panzers prowled. The prophet of armour and the Führer's guard are both gone, their iron titans now rusting in museums or buried under kilometres of peaceful farmland. We look to these woods not to celebrate the victory, but to reflect on the cost, the generation buried in the snow, and the world that was nearly lost to the dark dream of an architect who mistook map lines for human lives. Today, flowers grow in the craters, but the earth remembers.